This is a long-running and popular public series that covers current and timely topics in science. Many of you are Academy members and friends, and for those of you who are not familiar with us, I'm going to take just a couple moments to tell you a little bit about who we are, and then I'd like to mention a couple additional upcoming public science seminars you might have an interest in attending. The Academy is a local nonprofit, and we've been serving the St. Louis community and surrounding counties since 1856. We have a long-standing mission to advance the public understanding of science and inspire the next generation of scientists and science advocates. And we do that through a very broad range of free and low-cost public science programming, collaborative seminar series, and trips and tours that highlight science at venues throughout the region. And you can find more information on the Academy and our community-wide events and programs by visiting our website at academyofsciencestl.org. You can also visit us on Facebook or Twitter or pick up some of our literature that is just outside the auditorium on your way out. I'm sorry it wasn't here prior, but it is out there now. If you'd like to receive e-notification of upcoming Academy and St. Louis Zoo public lectures and events, there will be e-news sign-up sheets that will make their way around the audience. And we'll have stickers available at the visitor's desk following tonight's talk for any students that are here this evening who need to verify proof of attendance. Excuse me, so I'm going to tell you just a little bit about some of our upcoming science seminars that you might have an interest in on Friday, March 19th from 10 a.m. to 12 p.m. at St. Charles Community College. Missouri Department of Natural Resources Environmental Specialist Linda Weigerson talks about e-cycle, electronics recycling in Missouri. You do need to RSVP for that event. On Thursday, April 1 at Kirkwood High School, and as part of the Academy's Pioneering Science Seminar Series with the Kirkwood School District, we host a panel discussion with local scientists who will talk about bioethics, reproductive technologies, and genetics. And at 7 p.m. on Tuesday, April 6th, Missouri Botanical Garden, William L. Brown Center Assistant Curator Wendy Applequist talks about the science of medicinal plants at the Missouri History Museum's Lee Auditorium as part of our Perspectives on Science and History series. And then on Wednesday, April 7th, is the date for the last of our 2009-2010 Science Seminar Series talks. We have award-winning wildlife photographer and author Amy Gulick. She will be here in the Living World Auditorium at 7:30 p.m. for a book signing and talk, Salmon in the Trees, Life in Alaska's Tongass Rainforest. For the past 2 years, Amy's documented the grizzly bears, wolves, bald eagles, humpback whales, and wild salmon of the Tongass. At 17 million acres, the Tongass is America's largest national forest and a rare rainforest spread among thousands of islands in the panhandle of Alaska. And then lastly, we're pleased to partner with the St. Louis Zoo as well on Conservation Conversations, which is a public seminar series that highlights conservation science and global conservation issues and efforts that are supported by the zoo and other wildlife organizations. So on Tuesday, April 13, also at 7:30 p.m., here in the Living World Auditorium, environmental journalist, international consultant for natural resource management, and author of How the World's First Wildlife Forensics Lab is Solving Crimes and Saving Endangered Species, Laurel Nemi will be here for a book signing and talk on wild forensics. Wildlife smuggling is a $20 billion a year business that ranks just behind drugs and human trafficking as the third largest illegal trade worldwide. So again, you can find more information on these and even more science opportunities at our website, academyofsciencestl.org, or some of them can also be found in the literature outside the auditorium at the visitor's desk on your way out this evening. So with all that said, I'm going to introduce tonight's speaker, Bruce Lindsey. Bruce is Dean of the College of Architecture and Graduate School of Architecture and Urban Design, and E. Desmond Lee Professor for Community Collaboration with the Sam Fox School of Design and Visual Arts at Washington University in St. Louis. He is the former head of Auburn University's School of Architecture, where he also chaired the Masters of Landscape Architecture program and served as co-director of the architecture program's Rural Studio. Bruce earned his bachelor's degree in art and master's in sculpture and photography from the University of Utah. He earned a second master's in architecture from Yale University, and the following year joined the faculty at Carnegie Mellon, where he served as associate head of the School of Architecture and was an associate professor of art and architecture. He is the recipient of numerous awards for his work, including a Young Architects Award from Progressive Architecture, AIA's National Teaching Honor Award for his work in beginning design at Auburn, an AIA Design Merit Award for renovation of the Society for Contemporary Craft in Pittsburgh, and an AIA Design Honor Award for design along with Davis and Gannon Architects, of the Pittsburgh Glass Center, chosen as one of 2005's top 10 green buildings by the AIA's Committee on the Environment. He is here tonight to talk about sustainability in architecture. Won't you please join me in welcoming Bruce Lindsey.
Thank you, Rose, and thank all of you for coming tonight. I know there's lots going on. I think Mr. Obama is out in St. Charles, and I think there's a concert at the Pulitzer, but I'm glad that you're all here tonight. It's wonderful to be here. And as Rose said, my name is Bruce Lindsey, and I'm from Idaho. Anybody here from Idaho? Ah, damn. Oh, there's somebody in the back. Okay, good, fantastic. I'm an architect, as she mentioned. I went to Yale, which she also mentioned, but there was a time in my life when I considered myself an artist. And I'm beginning to think a little bit more about that recently. I went to art school at the University of Utah. I went to 2 years of college at Boise State University. And there I am, right there in my art days. My wife is also an artist. She's here tonight, Marilee Keys. And we're excited because we recently rented a studio at the City Museum downtown. But as you can see, I've been around a bit. And as Rose mentioned, we spent about 15 years in Pittsburgh at Carnegie Mellon. And 6 years before coming here to St. Louis at Auburn University. And for any football fans, that's Kenny Irons there. I should have had a picture of Cadillac Williams, but I think I need to go back to the web. And we live in Soulard. And I'm the dean, as she mentioned, which always surprises me. But anyway, we have 3 deans. Carmen Colangelo is the dean of the Sam Fox School, and Buzz Spector recently joined us as the dean of art. The Sam Fox School is a wonderful new idea that really is only about 4 years old, which brings the College of Art and the College of Architecture together, along with the Mildred Lane Kemper Art Museum, with an idea about the fact that there are things that we can do together that we can't do alone. 3 deans, it works for us. So as you can see, I've been around a bit, but I'm delighted to be here in St. Louis. It's an amazing city. It reminds us of Pittsburgh in many ways. And of course, I'm delighted to be here tonight. Now, I'm not sure if Rose mentioned, I can't remember in that introduction, but I'm also proud to be a part of a group at Washington University that is also relatively new. It's about 2 years old. It's called, and it's got one of those great academic acronym names, ICARES, which is the International Center for Advanced Renewable Energy and Sustainability. And so I'm going to be talking a little bit about that tonight. Now, Vitruvius, the first century Roman architect, and by the way, the author of one of the oldest treatises on architecture suggests that architecture with a capital A consists of landscapes, buildings, and machines. Vitruvius, by the way, is also the guy who said that architecture was composed of three main components: firmness, commodity, and delight. Firmness being the structural aspects of architecture, commodity being the program or the pragmatic or the utilitarian aspects of architecture, and delight being delight. But he also thought that you could take architecture and break it down into landscapes, buildings, and machines. Now, machines for Vitruvius, oh, by the way, there's Idaho. Here's the title. But machines for Vitruvius were timepieces, and more particularly sundials, which for him represented the full spectrum of the Earth and the planet. Now, architect Paul Shepard, in a little book that I would highly recommend if you have a chance to come across it, entitled "What is Architecture?" states, and I quote, "There is a scale of things all to do with the land, at one end of which are the forces of nature, the perception of which at any given place I would call landscape. At the other end of the scale are the local difficulties solved and the opportunities opened by our use of machines. And somewhere in between are the buildings, which, if conceived grandly and accurately enough, can extend outward to embrace each end of that scale," unquote. So, buildings in the middle, landscape on one end, and machines on the other. Now, I'm not a scientist, although a person I will talk about tonight once described himself as a quasi-pseudo-crypto scientist. And I'll let you guess who that is. I'm not a biologist nor an environmental historian, but as I mentioned a minute ago, an architect. And one who is inspired by, among other things, landscapes. And this might be best described by the following statement that's taken my wife Marilee and I a while to realize, but the longer we're away from the landscapes where we grew up, the more we feel we're from there. Now, I don't know if any of you feel that way, but we do. And as I mentioned, that's where we're from, a little town south of Boise in Nampa, Idaho. And we go back often, but it took us a while to realize that when we went back, we realized that there was something back in Pittsburgh that we were missing, and it was the sight of the horizon and the expanse of the landscape. And so I'm inspired by that. So tonight, while I will talk a little bit about the recent past and describe some ideas about sustainability, it will be more anecdotal than comprehensive and more about what inspires me about the current situation, which author Barry Lopez has described as a moment between stories. Now, I won't talk about doomsday statistics or climate change directly. And in fact, I believe that we are creating new stories, and the students and the faculty that I have the privilege of working with every day are creating stories for the future. And I was struck by a radio story. I was driving home from school yesterday, and I heard this radio story about Michelle Obama donated her inaugural gown to the Smithsonian. And I was thinking about environmental history, and I was thinking about talking here tonight. And I was thinking, what an amazing thing. On the one hand, she donates her gown to the Smithsonian, the History Museum, the U.S. History Museum. And I was wondering what an interesting thing, her gown, but of course it's a piece of visual culture, her gown. It is a part of history, material culture. I think increasingly we're understanding its importance as coinciding with our own histories. And imagine that gown in the Smithsonian along with the gowns of other first ladies and the kind of historical track of our sort of relationship to each other and our perceptions of how we present ourselves to the world might be embodied in that. I began to think of what is the material culture of the environment. Of course, it could be trees and things like that, but I began to wonder if it might not be buildings, in the way in which they have the capacity to represent our relationship to the landscape, to nature, and to each other. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Ian McHarg, but I like this quote. It'll make more sense later, I hope. And I had the chance to see the founder of Sun Microstations once say sarcastically that the sustainability is not a problem. It's just that we're likely not to be around to be a part of it. Now, this past September marked the 47th anniversary of the publishing of Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring. Now, this event is widely understood as marking the beginning of the modern environmental movement. It was partially syndicated in magazine articles in the New Yorker before it was released in September of 1962. And by November, the book had risen to the #1 top seller on the New York Times list. And it outlined in poetic and meticulously researched detail the persistent environmental effects of the pesticide DDT. Now, it took her 4 years to complete, and her book brought strong criticism from many people, including the chemical industry and including St. Louis-based Monsanto. And in fact, Monsanto published 5,000 copies of a parody entitled The Desolate Year that described a world where the banning of pesticides resulted in disease and famine from ravaging insects. I don't want to pick on Monsanto because the book was criticized by a number of different sectors and groups of people. But due to the brilliance of the internet, if you're interested, you can actually go to the web and download a copy of Desolate Year and check it out for yourself. But despite personal attacks and criticism that went so far as to describe Carson as a communist, her book, Silent Spring, was incredibly influential, and I think it's hard for us to imagine the degree to which basically a scientific text about the impacts of DDT. Within several months of its release, rose to the #1 top bestseller on the New York Times list. It, perhaps for the very first time, dramatically revealed the extent to which industrial society had separated itself from nature. The artist Bill Viola, he's a video artist, a really interesting guy. He poignantly makes that point in the quote. The degree of surprise that we register when we realize that the chemicals that we've poured into our rivers is now coursing through our veins is a measure of the distance that we have placed between ourselves and our environment. A poignant thought by Bill Viola. Now, Carson testified several times before Congress on the dangers of pesticides, and tragically she died of breast cancer in April of 1964 at the age of 56. DDT was banned in the United States in 1972, but remained in widespread use throughout the world for nearly 10 years, and it remains in use today. And while it may sound like a pretty clear-cut issue, it is a complicated issue, where in places around the world where malaria is a problem, the use of DDT can actually save lives. But it was an amazing work of research and writing in the book Silent Spring that brought some of the dangers of these kinds of practices to the general public's attention. In 1980, Rachel Carson was posthumously awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom. And in a CBS interview shortly before her death, Carson remarked, "But man is a part of nature, and his war against nature is inevitably a war against himself. We are challenged, as mankind has never been challenged before, to prove our maturity and our mastery, not of nature, but of ourselves." Now, 2 years after the publication of Silent Spring, economist Paul Sears described ecology as a subversive science. I love that quote. He actually really didn't call it subversive science. Initially, he called it a subversive subject, but then later published a collection of essays by friends of his, other scientists, called Subversive Science. And he called ecology basically a subversive subject because it called into the question for him the cultural and economic premises of Western societies, pointing out the ironic fact that the root word for economics and ecology is the Greek word oikos for house, household or family. Now, when I first told Rose that I was going to title my lecture Subversive Science, she wrote back, and I think she was a little nervous about what I was going to say about science in a lecture hosted by the American Academy of Science. I hope that perhaps my interest in that topic is more related to a kind of mischievousness than an actual criticism of science, but I appreciate Paul Sears and the early voices of the environmental movement for calling our attention to many of the things that we are now beginning to know so much more about today. Now, 6 years after Carson's book was published on Christmas Eve, 1968, Apollo 8 astronaut Bill Anders took the first picture of the Earth from space rising above the moon that was published shortly thereafter in Life magazine. These pictures are so ubiquitous, it's hard for us to understand that moment when for the very first time someone saw the Earth from outside the atmosphere and had a perspective or a picture like this. This is it, Earthrise, that was published on the cover of Life magazine. Of course, the astronauts that have seen this talk about it being a transformative experience, and how often the perspective of the atmosphere, which appears to be a very thin and fragile layer around the Earth, catalyzes for them the sort of beautiful relationship between the Earth and its environment. Now, this photograph actually inspired a man by the name of John Connell to propose the first Earth Day at a UNESCO conference on the environment, literally the year after that picture was first published. Now, parallel to Connell's vision was the extension of, and some of you may remember these, they were called teach-ins, but it was an environmental teach-in led by the later U.S. Senator Gaylord Nelson of Wisconsin that resulted in the Earth Day celebration, the first Earth Day celebration on April 22nd, 1970. Now, that very first celebration, it's amazing to realize, involved an estimated 20 million people around the world, including a professor of biology from Washington University named Barry Commoner. Anybody here know him? Yeah, a few people. I think some of his graduate students are tenured professors at WashU now. It's pretty amazing, though, that on that first Earth Day, and by the way, I understand that he went around to several different celebrations that same day and gave talks. But he was a biology professor at Washington University, again, his name Barry Commoner. And Earth Day now is celebrated by over 500 million people in over 175 countries, and is by some accounts the largest secular celebration in the world. In 1980, Senator Nelson became a counselor of the Wilderness Society, and in 1995 was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom in recognition for his environmental work. Now, Commoner, generally referred to as a founding father, like Rachel Carson, of modern environmentalism, was called by Time magazine, and here you see him on the cover, as the Paul Revere of ecology, I think 1970. Pretty interesting figure. And his early book, The Closing Circle, Nature, Man, and Technology, published in 1971, outlines 4 laws of ecology, and those being, 1, that everything is connected to everything else; 2, everything must go somewhere, and the book describes these in a little more detail. The 3rd, nature knows best, and the 4th, there's no such thing as a free lunch. And you'll hear in a minute that first one he stole from someone else. Now, Commoner, who will be 93 this May, lives in Brooklyn. And during his 1980 presidential bid, a reporter asked him, "Dr. Commoner, are you a serious candidate, or are you just running on the issues?" I had the chance to invite an amazing person to Washington University to talk. He's the former director of the Center for Disease and Control, and he's been working on issues of health and the environment for a long time. And I was asking him if he knew about Barry Commoner, and he said, "Oh yeah, I voted for him in 1980." So Woody Allen says, "I am two with nature." In the West, the longer history of environmental awareness in the 19th century paralleled the emergence of biology as a science. And we might even say that the physical sciences and biology are coming together in the context of sustainability as we speak. But according to the environmental historian Donald Wooster, this age may be called the Age of Ecology for the role it played in the foundations of contemporary environmental thought, and by that I mean beginning from the 60s on. Or actually, as you'll see, perhaps even from the 40s and the 30s. In North America, the 19th century view was primarily formed by 2 fundamental ideas. The first, following on the work of Emerson and then Thoreau, was that man and nature are one. Ralph Waldo Emerson's Nature was first published anonymously in 1836, and the short book, which was inspired by a visit to the Natural History Museum in Paris, outlined the spiritual dimensions of nature where, and I quote, "Therefore, all that is separate from us, all which philosophy distinguishes as the not me, this is both nature and art, all other men and my own body must be ranked under this name, nature." Now, on land owned by Emerson, Henry David Thoreau began his experiment in walking, living, and recording nature on Walden Pond that resulted in Walden, or Life in the Woods, published in 1854. As much a treatise on time as nature, his proposition of economy was an American pragmatism that sought transcendence through a nature that precedes and follows us. In fact, Walden and Thoreau often called, or members of a group called the Transcendentalists. And I quote, "Only that day dawns to which we are awake. There is more day to dawn," unquote. A lesser-known essay by Thoreau titled Resistance to Civil Government, later retitled Civil Disobedience, warned that democracy does not necessarily prevent governments from co-opting citizens as partners of injustice. Seen as the origins of the idea of nonviolent resistance, the essay was very influential in the thinking of Martin Luther King, Gandhi, and Nelson Mandela. In fact, Nelson Mandela had a copy of it in his prison cell. The essay articulates a citizen's inevitable ethical responsibility, and alongside Walden prefigures the environmental dimensions of justice. So, the first theme is that man and nature are one. The second theme from the Age of Ecology is that man is capable of enlightened management. This comes full force in the book Man and Nature, published in 1864 by George Perkins Marsh, and here you see him. The book, later subtitled The Earth is Modified by Human Nature, is the first book to describe the interdependence of society and nature. Using historical examples, Marsh described the likely outcome of resource depletion, but he believed that ultimately nature should be managed for the benefit of man. He hoped for, and I quote, "a community engaged in agriculture and all the civilized arts, and such a community cannot exist without transforming the landscape," unquote. Now, Clifford Pinchot, founder of the U.S. Forest Service under President Theodore Roosevelt, was influenced by Marsh's book, Man and Nature, and coined the term, actually, conservation in reference to natural resources. Now, he went on to describe himself as the father of conservation. Pinchot worked closely with Roosevelt, helping to create forest reserves, wildlife refuges, and over 17 national monuments, including the Grand Canyon National Monument in 1908. The Sierra Club, first founded by Pinchot's friend and later antagonist, John Muir, in 1892, and here you see Muir and Teddy Roosevelt, helped raise the awareness of the value of wilderness. In 1864, while the Civil War raged, Abraham Lincoln signed into law that the 39,000 acres of Yosemite and Mariposa areas of Southern California should be preserved for public use and recreation. Imagine that, 1864, that's pretty amazing. Followed by the designation of Yellowstone as the first national park, and I quote, "for the benefit and enjoyment of the people" in 1872, and the first forest preserve in 1891. It led to the formation of the National Park Service in 1916. Muir's differences with Pinchot that were popularly described in the local press at the time described the two sides of a debate that continues today. Pinchot believed that conservation and the protection of nature should be for the common good. And Muir, who is credited with saying, "everything is connected to everything else," so there you see where Barry Commoner got his first rule of conservation in his book, The Closing Circle, believed that preservation was an ethical and a moral responsibility. So, we are one with nature, or it is our duty to preserve nature or to conserve nature. Now, Aldo Leopold provides an interesting bridge between these different ideas about our relationship to our environment. A Sand County Almanac, some of you have probably read it, it's an amazing book, was published in 1949, shortly after Aldo's death. And while Leopold's work is generally seen as being a part of the conservation movement, his ideas begin to reconcile the differences between conservation and preservation through his land ethic and an ecological conscience. The book is organized in three parts, with the first being a series of what he called shack sketches, arranged seasonally as an almanac, and so you can read them month by month. The second series of essays he calls episodes, outline his ideas about conservation, and the third section, called Upshot, presents his philosophy of the land. Now, Leopold was one of the first graduates of the Yale School of Forestry, one of the great schools of forestry in the world. My grandfather was a forest ranger in Montana, and as I mentioned, I went to Yale, and I went and saw him often when I was in graduate school. And he used to talk about the interns that he would have from Yale there for the summer in the Yak Valley of Montana, and he used to take great pleasure in saying how he would play tricks on them by saying, "Go check out that garbage can, somebody tipped it over," and he, having gotten there a little earlier, knowing there was a skunk in the garbage can. But Leopold was, at the turn of the century, one of the earliest graduates of that amazing program that continues today. But he was born in Iowa in 1887, and he left the Forest Service after 19 years to join the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where he worked in the Forest Products Research Lab. and he did wildlife and game surveys throughout the U.S. In 1935, he was one of the 8 founding members of the Wilderness Society, and in 1927, due much to his effort, the Aldo Leopold Wilderness Area within the Guia National Forest in New Mexico became the first designated wilderness area in the United States. Now, he's widely known for having written the Sand County Almanac, but he's lesser known for having conducted a multi-year, over the course of really more than 20 years, experiment at the University of Madison, or Wisconsin-Madison. He had about 300 acres, and I think I might have a picture of it. He wanted to know what would happen if he just let it go. As you can see, it had one time been tended as pasture land. And so he was going to conduct an experiment, and he was going to see what would happen if this piece of land would return to its natural state. And of course, he began to see the succession of different kinds of plant communities happen over the years, and at about 7 or 8 or 9 years out, he noticed that at that time what was beginning to look like an emerging prairie, although not a very healthy one, seemed to be in trouble. And he had an instinct of what was wrong. And so he burned it. And it was one of the early experiments sort of working on the idea of disturbance processes in landscapes and the need for those kinds of things to be a part of their health and ecological well-being. But one of his most important essays, or most famous essays in the book Sand County Almanac, is called Thinking Like a Mountain. And it describes a turning point in Leopold's understanding of nature. While eating lunch with friends on a high rim rock overlooking a rushing river, the group saw a she-wolf and pups emerge from the forest edge. They were actually out hunting wolves to thin the population. But having seen the wolf and her cubs emerge from the forest edge and head towards the river, they emptied their rifles, and the mother wolf was down. Leopold went down and knelt over the dying animal and described seeing, and I quote, "a fierce green fire dying in her eyes." He sensed that there was something important that not only the mountain and the wolf knew. In his initial joyful view, saw fewer wolves as meaning more deer. But, and I quote, he realized then, or he said, "I realized then, and have known ever since," he said, "that neither the wolf nor the mountain agreed with such a view." Leopold went on to describe the need for a land ethic. Ethics, a mode of guidance, first deals with the relationship between individuals. I find that inspiring, the idea of a land ethic. He went on, though, to describe a second ethic between an individual and their place within society. But he called for a third ethic, a kind of community instinct in the making, which included the land, all animals, and the plants. And this third ethic would found ethics on a single premise. Leopold states, and I quote, that the individual is a member of a community of interdependent parts, unquote. He described a land ethic as the basic concept of ecology that demanded an ecological conscience, placing us squarely within land as a community. And for me, bridging the gap between us as a part of nature or us as a conserver of nature. And he went on to describe land as a community reflected both the diverse and necessarily inclusive biotic population and the implication of citizenship that demonstrated the inherent ethical responsibilities. So, a land ethic, land as a community, and a mode of guidance. Ian McHarg, he's the guy that was the crypto-pseudo-scientific science, or crypto-quasi-scientific scientist. And he says, and I quote, "We seems a more appropriate description for ecological relationships." Ian McHarg, the late Scottish landscape architect and teacher, proposed a theory of one based on the idea of creative fitting in health, and its antithesis in a reductive non-fit revealed in pathology. McHarg proposed a theory of one with 4 parts. So it starts off a little abstractly, if you'll bear with me. Part 1 of the theory of one in 4 parts is the first requirement for fit is creativity. Now, he defined creativity rather abstractly, but specifically as the employment of energy and matter to raise matter and energy to higher levels of order. Now, I'll say that again because it takes me a minute to follow it. He defined creativity as the employment of energy and matter to raise matter and energy to higher levels of order. And luckily, he gives us a good example. He uses a forest as an example of a high level of order and suggests that if you burn it, according to the second law of thermodynamics, no matter has been removed or destroyed, but the forest has gone to a lower level of order. Creativity is the inverse of this. In other words, creativity is the employment of energy to raise matter to a higher level of order. It's kind of abstract, but I think a beautiful description of creativity. And it gets better, I think, as we hear the other 3 parts. So part 2 is the second requirement for this theory is that you have to have a criterion for directionality. You got to be able to tell whether it's going to a higher level of order or a lower level of order. And here he suggests that creativity moves from conditions of greater to lesser randomness, which sounds reasonable, but from simplicity to complexity. So it's interesting that for him, lesser randomness becomes greater complexity, which is a higher degree of order. And more importantly, a higher order means moving from uniformity to diversity. And of course, in our understandings of ecological communities, resilience is the attribute of diversity often, that a diverse community can withstand onslaught and survive. But he also said that a criterion of directionality from lower to higher order was a move from instability to dynamic instability, or dynamic equilibrium. Now, if we see a process move in this direction, it's creative. Put the 2 together, and it must follow that life seeks the most fit environment and adapts it in itself to a higher order. That might be, in fact, a description of life. Now, part 3, this, by necessity, must be a creative process. Survival is contingent upon finding the least work, maximum benefit solution. That's where he's being a scientist talking. And there's an aesthetic dimension to this that cannot be overlooked. Fit is not just fitting in, but creatively adapting, and we can understand that. But even more importantly, expressing a result that inspires new adaptations. And that's where the dynamic component of that instability continues to feed back into itself. Now, part 4 of his theory of one in 4 parts is direct. He says, health is the attribute of the creative fitting and adapting of environment and process. I'll say that again. Health is the attribute of the creative fitting and adapting of environment and process. Now, I mentioned Ian McHarg was a landscape architect. In fact, he founded the program of landscape architecture at the University of Pennsylvania. And some of you may know that the landscape architect Frederick Law Olmsted is often called the father of landscape architecture, an American garden designer who founded the profession and discipline of landscape architecture in the middle 1800s. And Frederick Law Olmsted, of course, most widely known for designing Central Park in New York City, but what's not widely known, and that project continued through the Civil War, is that he proposed it not only as a great work of art for the city of New York, but as a public works project, and in fact it did serve that purpose. But little known, he proposed it as a public health project. So, part 4 is direct. Health is the attribute of the creative fitting and adapting. But McHarg used 2 definitions of health. He said the first is that health is the capability to recover from insult. And again, it puts it in a more broad environmental context. The second definition, he said, is that, and this comes from the World Health Organization, that a healthy person, the World Health Organization defines a healthy person as one who not only solves problems but seeks them, and any system is required to find of all environments, the most fit to adapt that environment and to adapt itself. So in summary, according to McHarg, an environment that enables us is creative and can be identified as creative by its adaptive fit, and creative fitting is required for life, the result being health. So that's the formal part of my talk. And given the number of people here, we can be a little bit more informal as we go through the second half. And I'm going to show you some projects about that perhaps describe some ideas about sustainability. And I'd be happy to answer questions as we go through these. And I have a bunch of them, so we'll see how far we get. According to buildings, I guess sustainability is a hot topic, you might say. My colleague and friend Jenny Lovell, who recently came from the University of Virginia a few years ago, was laughing when Madonna was on the cover of the Vanity Fair green issue, and inside that issue was the famous green architect William McDonough, and she was laughing, going around saying, Madonna, McDonough, Madonna, McDonough, Madonna, and so here you see them both. William McDonough, though, a very brilliant architect, and having written a very influential book called Cradle to Cradle, where he talks about one of the aspects of sustainable architecture is being able to design and to consider a building throughout its lifespan. Now, we may sort of understand that intuitively when we think about building a building sustainably, but it also means thinking about what happens when we take buildings down, or the value of reusing them. In Europe, where the building codes are to some degree more restrictive, but also we might say in some cases more advanced than in the United States, architects are often required to estimate the cost and the sort of waste stream of a building when it's torn down. This is when they're proposing the design for a new building. So just a guess, if anybody want to guess, how much does it cost to tear down a building and reconstitute the materials of that building back into the material stream of products and waste in relationship to how much it costs to build one? How much does it cost to tear one down? Any guesses? Half? 20%? 3.5 times as much. To tear a building down, not just the physical act of tearing it down, but dealing with all the materials when you think of them going into the landfill and all of the other costs that are associated with that building, the infrastructure costs that were a part of its initial construction. And so architects are beginning to think not only about the cost of building, but the cost of recycling in that way. But sustainability is a hot topic, as I mentioned, and I know that we're all inspired by how many of these issues are coming to the fore. I think also some of us are sort of a little tired of hearing about the statistics, but in fact I think it is important that we pay attention. I don't know if any of you saw this, but less than a year ago the Pope changed the 7 deadly sins to include, as you can see there, polluting the environment. So not to be outdone, I think this is the Baptists described that they hadn't done enough to protect the environment. But sustainability in relationship to development was first really proposed in a report that was published in the early 80s, not that long ago. And its relationship to development was first in relationship to urban design and not necessarily in relationship specifically to architecture. But it was in a report titled the Brundtland Report that came out of the United Nations. It entitled the Brundtland Report because of the chair of the committee, Gro Harlem Brundtland, who was the former prime minister of Norway. But here you can see the often understood or quoted definition of sustainability that came out of that report. That sustainable development is a development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And of course, as this definition has been inspiring, it's also garnered criticism in relationship to what might be problems of unlimited growth that are at least implied by that statement. There you see Prime Minister Brundtland. She was awarded the Thomas Jefferson Medal of Architecture 2 years ago for her work in sustainability. But when it comes to buildings, we know some things that, again, if you haven't thought about them in this particular way, they might be surprising to you. That if we look at the entire energy consumption by sectors in the United States, buildings make up a good deal of that consumption. And if we look at U.S. electrical consumption, you can see that buildings account for a great deal of our use of energy. And we also know that, of course, there are other kinds of issues related to sustainability that have to do with inequities, environmental issues of environmental justice, and ultimately, which is what I think sustainability is most profoundly about, which is environmental ethics, as was beginning to be proposed by Aldo Leopold. And in that regard, I have to share with you one of my inspirations. As Rose mentioned, I was at Auburn University, where I worked and lived for 6 years, and had the privilege of going there to work with an architect who had a very interesting idea about not only the education of architects, but about how architecture might be practiced. And this is the guy. His name is Samuel Mockbee, and he founded a program called the Rural Studio. And he had some very interesting ideas about architecture, one of which I'll share with you here, which is that architecture must be more than architecture. In other words, if in fact buildings, as I was suggesting, might be the material culture of that best expresses the relationship between each other and our environment, then it has a large role to play, including sheltering us from the rain, but also inspiring our dreams. He also felt that architects needed to be subversive. He said they needed to challenge the status quo. He said they needed to cross thresholds and sneak behind enemy lines and sort of propose the value of what architecture can do. He was also a very straightforward guy, and often we laughed around our favorite definition of architecture, which was that its greatest role was to improve the weather. So here you see him. The Rural Studio was a program that was revolutionary in respect to architectural education. It might sound a little strange given the kind of obviousness of it, but he proposed that architecture students work in the community, and they did in the central part of rural Alabama, about 2.5 hours from the university. He proposed that they would design works for and within the community, and that they would not only design them, but build them. And as you can see, he felt that architects had a responsibility to do reconnaissance on the social and environmental edge. These are some books if you're interested in the program. I'm not going to speak to this at length, but I wanted to share with you some of my background and interest in at least one aspect of architecture. The first house that the students designed and built was for Shepard and Alberta Bryant, and here you see them. It was in the little town of Masons Bend, Alabama, a small community of 4 extended families of about 100 people. And the students designed and built this house. Shepard wanted a front porch, and that was about it, but the students designed and built it out of straw bale construction. And really an ancient technique of construction that makes a whole lot of sense, very good insulation. The straw has no nutrients in it, so bugs don't like it. You cover it up with stucco, and it's nearly impervious to the weather. And here you see it under construction, and yes, indeed, it is made out of straw. And there's Shepard in his yard with his chickens, and the smokehouse in the back, which the students also built from recycled construction waste from a road demolition project. And there's the back of the house with the 3 sleeping pods for the grandkids. Shepard and Alberta raised their grandkids. Shepard was a fisherman. The house is near the Black Warrior River.
So, for example, he used bales of hay as support structures for a house that he did for this client.
Hey, she is. Hey, say hello to Robert here.
Mrs. Alberta Bryant, who was, needless to say, a little confused.
What they doing with all this hay? I said, they gonna build a house.
So then she explained how Sambo trucked in bale after bale after bale of hay in big stacks.
Wait a second, he's going to build you a house with hay.
Hey,
What kind of a house would that be?
a straw house,
A straw
a
house?
hay house. This what this is.
Yeah. I know. Have you ever heard of a straw house before?
They asked me, I ain't know nothing about no straw
Yeah.
house. Read the poem about the pigs. And
Right, the three little pigs.
Yeah.
That's what I was thinking.
And I said, you said a hay house? Yeah.
But remember, this is a free hay house. How does she feel about one that's for free?
Just fine. To me, I ain't make no difference what kind of house it was.
So there she is. She's the matriarch of the extended family, and she suffers from diabetes, and when she gets excited, she shakes her leg at you when she's talking. The second house was for their neighbors, Anderson and Orlee, and affectionately it's called the Butterfly House. And a project that's been ongoing for a while, which is an extraordinary project, working in the community to design a house for $20,000. There's a little-known loan program from the Department of Agriculture where low-income families can qualify for a low-income loan to produce a house, and if you're on welfare, that's $540 a month. And so the amount of loan for the house that you can qualify for making that much money costs $20,000. And so the students have been building prototypes and working on a house that would be built for $10,000 in materials and $10,000 in labor, so that the prototype houses could be given to the construction community and built within the community itself. So here you see one of them. That one was about $21,000, I think. So I'm not going to talk about the richest woman in the world, but I'm going to go through some projects here and talk just about some basic ideas. But first I wanted to explain a little bit more about, I talked about, or Paul Shepard quoted the idea of the landscape on the one end and buildings in the middle and machines on the other side, and I was beginning to suggest that McHarg and Leopold kind of bridged an idea about us being sort of both a part of nature and sort of in between, wanting to preserve and conserve nature. And for me, I think buildings have that kind of in-between quality. I think contemporary buildings, new ideas about buildings and sustainability are becoming more like interfaces than buildings that we traditionally know. They're becoming interfaces between ourselves and our environment. If you think about it, a building separates us from the environment and then reintroduces us to the environment through windows, through mechanical means, heaters, air conditioners, those kinds of things, right? It separates us through the roof. And then it very strategically reintroduces us to the environment. It also introduces us to each other. Architecture does. It also prevents us from introducing ourselves to each other. So in that way, buildings could be understood as a kind of interface between ourselves and each other and ourselves and our environment. And in that nature of dynamic instability that Leopold was talking about, I think buildings are becoming increasingly dynamic and malleable in that interface, and that we're no longer simply separating ourselves from the environment and placing a window that allows us to see it, but we're designing and inventing new windows that allow that window to connect us to the environment in ways that are profound and also direct. My friend Vivian Lofness, who's an expert in sustainability, said that the most important technological innovation in architecture in the recent last 15 years was the operable window. For a long, long time, engineers have been sealing up buildings because it sort of allowed them to deal with the internal mechanisms mechanically, and now we're seeing the value of allowing our buildings to breathe, which allows us to breathe, and also sort of saves energy and produces psychic energy. This is a project by a recent faculty member at our school, Christoph Jansen. It's a building in Cambridge, Massachusetts called the Genzyme Building. This is a cross-section of it, so you're seeing the building cut in half, but the building has a big atrium in the middle, and it's an office building. They do bioresearch there. My thing isn't working very well. But that big hole in the middle allows light, and there are mirrors up at the top, and it redirects the sunlight down in the interior of the building. And it also allows fresh air to ventilate down through that shaft, and also exhaust using pressure differential in the summer to get the hot air out. So imagine being on the interior office of this building and being able to open your window and to feel the breeze. So it's an amazing building. And here you see a description of how those reflectors work. The building uses substantially less energy to light and is an amazing environment to work in. He's a principal with the architectural firm Danish Architects, which is located in Stuttgart, but he runs the Los Angeles office and is teaching with us and our students. Here's a picture of the outside of that building. This is a colleague, Paul Donnelly, who teaches a studio, and in this case, Chicago. Tall buildings that, if you can believe it, make more energy than they use. They harness the wind and the sun to produce energy. And here you see a description of this project designed by a student in Paul's class that begins to talk about that. A pretty tall building. This building, interestingly enough, is not just offices, but includes a high school and commercial and retail and housing. So in some ways, it's a small city unto itself. So sustainability is also about technology. This is a beautiful table designed by Charles Eames, the artist and designer, with his wife Ray Eames and partner. But tragically was a one-of-a-kind table that was destroyed in a fire. And Sung-Ho Kim and Heather Woofter, principals in the firm Axiomi, Sung-Ho's here tonight, were charged with recreating this table, and all they had was this photograph. So what do? Well, they make models, and you can kind of try to figure it out, but then they started to model it in the computer from the perspective, reverse engineering the perspective of the photograph to begin to create a three-dimensional computer model that allowed them both to determine eventually the specific size and proportions and shape of that table, but ultimately also to develop cross-sectional structural diagrams that were related to how the project would be built. And here you see some of those geometric calculations. That this is the computer model, the three-dimensional computer model, and some of the calculations that come from that that allowed them to not only produce the information that they needed to recreate the table, but to test it in the computer structurally, both with regard to its own structure, but to the mechanics of its manufacturing. There you see a beautiful three-dimensional model of the table and the final rendering. And I don't have a picture of the finished one. I got to get a picture of that. So. Sustainability and economics. Derek Hefferlin, a member of our faculty, has been working in New Orleans for over 5 years, and in fact, he was there with students about a week and a half ago, meeting with an architect, David Wagner, and the director of city planning, and a group of landscape architecture students from the University of Toronto, and faculty member Jane Wolfe, who they're partnering with to work on a plan for water for the city of New Orleans. And the students' work has been extremely influential in the city's dialogues about thinking about that. And in fact, we hosted last week the ambassador of the Netherlands to the United States, who was at Washington University talking with the students and the faculty, and David Wagner from New Orleans, about the relationship that's developed between the Dutch engineers and the city officials and engineers in New Orleans. As you might expect, the Dutch have a lot of experience, and in fact, the ambassador said 800 years of mistakes that they've made relative to Holland's planning for water. They used to plan to build bigger dikes and engineer great industrial technologies that would protect them from the floods or from the rising tides. They have since changed, and this is only within the last 5 years, to begin to develop a new plan that's called Living with Water. So they're developing new developments that float, developments that resist the rising tide, and that work more in concert with nature rather than trying to keep it out. But they've been working with the students, and here you see some of their work. A couple of years ago, they partnered with a nonprofit group called the Good Work Network, and the students proposed a project with students from the business school at MIT to redevelop this nonprofit historic building in a neighborhood in New Orleans. They entered a competition and won $25,000 for the nonprofit. Here you see one of the students on TV. And then 3 years ago, they got to know a man by the name of Noel who had a small urban farm in New Orleans, and the chicken coop for that farm had been destroyed by Hurricane Katrina, and they needed a new one. So the students designed and prefabricated a chicken coop. They built it in the halls of Givens, put it in a van, and drove it to New Orleans and installed it. So here you see the plans. It's a very sophisticated chicken coop. There's the site plan for the urban garden that they helped work out with Noel. And there you see him building it, and there's the chicken coop. So it works well. There you see the chickens in it. And the students were, the next year, worried because Hurricane Ivan came. And now they were diligent and had designed the chicken coop to withstand a Category 4 hurricane. And Ivan, I think, got to Category 4, and so they were desperately awaiting a call from Noel to make sure that the chicken coop survived Hurricane Ivan, which in fact it did, and they have a picture, and I'm sorry I don't have it, but the chickens were safe, along with the dog of Noel, who took shelter in the chicken coop. So here you see the work of the students. So sustainability in politics. In the morning, I'm headed to Nanjing, China, and I've never been to China. I'm looking forward to it. Our urban design students are there working with students from Southeast University in Nanjing on an urban design project in Nanjing, China. But several years ago, they were in San Diego working on a project in Tijuana, Mexico. Tijuana is an amazing place. It, of course, is part of the Tijuana River watershed, but what many of you may not know is that the Tijuana River watershed is bisected by the national boundary of Mexico and the United States, and severely impacts the city of San Diego, and of course is an absolute important dynamic in the city of Tijuana, which is last year one of the fastest growing cities in Mexico. Some of the informal settlements that are part of Tijuana's development is really the urbanism of the emerging world. That kind of urbanism is going to happen and is happening at an increasing rate, and understanding its dynamic and the sort of lessons that it can tell are very important. And so here you see some of the projects that the students did in Tijuana, working with the local planning agency, IMPLAN. This is a canyon in Tijuana, and the students were proposing new kinds of funicular connections across the canyon and a new watershed water infrastructure that went down through the center. When it rains, the water comes down through the settlements and developments and right down through the canyons into the estuary of the Tijuana River, and is an incredibly difficult environmental situation. The National Park Service, ironically, has gotten involved in that effort, knowing that the development patterns of Tijuana were important to the development of San Diego, and they've started to partner on plans to help alleviate some of the difficulties. This all the while the United States now having built not one but 3 walls between Tijuana and Mexico, or San Diego and Mexico. This project, by the way, won an Urban Land Institute Smart Growth Award last year. Sustainability and Ethics, a project by faculty member Don Coster and students, both undergraduate and graduate, that really has been going on for 3 years, in partnership with the American Institute of Architects, who were celebrating 3 years ago their 150th anniversary, and were looking to partner with projects, or 4 projects all around the country. And they came to the school and had done a charrette in the Ville neighborhood of St. Louis, and had identified through community meetings the interest in the community to develop a farmer's market. And so the students got busy, and they had a seminar class and began to design the farmer's market. They had community meetings to talk about what people might want, and they designed the building, an amazing building that collects the rainwater for the gardens. It has a wind turbine to provide electricity, photovoltaics on the roof, works as a community center when it's not operating as a farmer's market, is naturally ventilated, and would use labor in part donated from the construction trade apprentice programs and students working. Students worked as interns during the summer for Carl Grice, a local architect, and got internship credit, and they produced the legal documents ready to build the program and the building. And they've been raising money now for about 1.5 years. But the students in the second class realized that there was something missing, and it was the community infrastructure to keep this thing going. They realized that a building without a building that wasn't successful in the community would be no building at all. And so the students worked with the Scandalaire Center for Entrepreneurial Activity and the community leaders to develop a nonprofit community organization to help guide the development of the program. And so it's still in progress, but most recently, due to Senator Clay's efforts, received $300,000 in stimulus funding and will likely begin construction this summer. So here you see some of the plans with the way in which the landscape retains the water on site and uses and recycles the water for the irrigation of the community garden. This is on, I'm sorry? It's on Martin Luther King Boulevard in the Ville. Sustainability and health, I talked a little bit about that with Leopold, but just a continued dimension of that farmer's market. Don Coster has partnered with a member of the faculty in the medical school, and they've gotten a small grant to work on ideas of how learning about nutrition in the Sumner High School, programming for the farmers market, might be a worthwhile thing to do. And so they've begun to look at the relationship between farmers markets and community health, and have been holding community meetings, and actually have been in part, many others are involved, but spawned a movement and a group of people that are beginning to talk about food and nutrition that will ultimately lead to a food plan for the state of Missouri. So here you see an event that they had last October that involved public health screenings with the farmers market. And a project by faculty member Jody Polson in Pagedale, where using a very specific method called health impact assessment is working with the community to identify key health issues in the community, and then looking at development plans, in this case a master plan for Pagedale, to see if the master plan can be modified to improve public health outcomes. And she's working with faculty from Berkeley on that. But a project that perhaps is, at least for me, a little bit more, not inspirational, but a little bit more, I guess, theoretical is not the right word. It's just, for me, a project that I in a way, kind of, I can't get over. It's a project by a grad student named Emily Garrett, and some of you may know the Pruitt-Igoe site. This is Pruitt-Igoe, which was in the north of St. Louis. What many of you may not know was that a very famous architectural historian by the name of Charles Jenks, in a book, cited that the day that Pruitt-Igoe was blown up, which was 1972, marked the death of modern architecture. So for architects, this site, which still stands vacant today in St. Louis, it was an enormous housing project that had some initial success, but went clearly downhill very quickly, and was blown up within 25 years of its construction, is seen as a kind of haunted site. And our degree project students who choose project sites in St. Louis often choose this site, but for me it's always, and for many, it's haunted. It's kind of a very difficult place and situation in the city. But Emily had an idea. She had an idea to sort of develop an urban farm on this site that would be patterned relative to the original scale of the residential blocks that used to be there before Pruitt-Igoe was built. And you can see that in this drawing on the left. And that the urban farm was not just a project about growing food, although it was that, but it was a redevelopment project that would start out as an urban farm. It would have a farmer's market and an educational center and a community center and all of those things it needed to support the farm. But the goal of the farm was to redevelop the neighborhood back to its mixed-use diversity and vitality. So it was a 50-year project. And while this project is not likely to happen in this way, I think ideas related to this kind of thinking about the city of St. Louis are happening all over. And it's a proud, I think, time for the city of St. Louis. So form follows sustainability, an interesting project. Form follows function is a famous adage of architecture, said to have been quoted by Louis Sullivan. But here you see a competition entry to the Stedman competition, which is an annual competition that the university sponsors, for a building that, as you can see, if you can read it, is a contemporary observatory for new dialogues among humans and non-humans. But what's cool about it, I think, as you can see, is it's partly a traditional building. You can see the foundations in this section on the left, but then you'll notice that perhaps the top of it's a little unconventional in that it's alive. And here you see some renderings of what the interior might be like. So definitely one of those buildings that at least in intention, is beginning to be in the middle, to be that mediator, to be that connector between ourselves and our environment. And then a blatant plug. This fall we'll be welcoming our first students into a new professional program in landscape architecture, the first one in Missouri. Landscape architecture, as I mentioned, pioneered by Frederick Law Olmsted, it probably is fair to say are on the cutting edge of sustainable design all around the world. And we're proud to welcome Dorothée Imbert from Harvard, most recently, but originally from Paris, to be the chair of that new program. And the first students will be arriving in the fall. And here you see a project that she proposed for Alton, a development where Harvard is thinking about expanding, but again, an idea about urban agriculture. And this is a book that just recently was published by her. So I'm getting close to the end, and we can have some questions, but kind of in conclusion, a visiting faculty member by the name of Mitch Joachim was teaching with us for a year. Here you see, not long ago, the cover of Wired magazine, and Mitch was listed as one of the 15 people that the next president should talk to. And Mitch has an interesting perspective on architecture. He's got like PhDs and master's degrees and everything, including architecture and urban design. And he was at the MIT Media Lab, but he was working on a project with Frank Gehry and William Mitchell, the computer guru from Massachusetts Institute of Technology, on designing a new car. And here you see it. But it is kind of an odd-looking car, but what's so amazing about it is that, and let me go back, is that it was based on an idea that for too long, cities had been designed for cars and not for people. And so he was going to design a car that would allow cities to be redesigned for people, and the car would have to adapt. So first thing, cars got to be soft, so if the car hits anybody, it's not going to hurt. The car has to know where it is and know where it's going, and it flocks and it moves slowly, and you rent it and lease it, and you don't own it, and you don't have to park it because it kind of clusters itself and recharges its batteries, and there you see a kind of small version based on sneakers. And the car could even climb up the side of a building and become an elevator, and then you see that elevator making its own energy. And there you see the readapted city where the cars no longer would have streets. In this case, you see them in a transitional state, but the streets would no longer be necessary because people could use and cross anywhere. The cars would avoid the people, and so it was a beautiful idea, I thought, anyway. And then finally, a project by Mitch that is based on Esplenier. Did I get that right? Any gardeners in the audience? I think it's a technique, an old ancient technique of working with plants to form them into unusual structures. And so Mitch was inspired by this technique. And here you see an example of it. But in the case of applying it to a house, if you want one, you may want to order it now because it takes about 45 years. And there it is. So the 19th century scholar and economist Robert Malthus warned that the degradation of the environment was the inevitable outcome of a free market society, where the need to increase profit results in growth, which equals resource exploitation, which equals resource exhaustion. And Malthus was influential in the thinking of Charles Darwin, and he also studied population growth and provided ideas central to the then emerging concept of natural selection. But Frederick Soddy, 1877, a Nobel laureate in chemistry, was disenchanted by the mass deaths of World War I and gave up chemistry to pursue political economy. And Soddy was unsatisfied with the thinking of the day, which likened the economy to a machine able to generate perpetual wealth. And he drew an analogy between economics and physics, and in particular, the second law of thermodynamics. And author Annie Dillard, in her book Pilgrim at Tinker Creek, illuminates for us, and I quote, "According to the second law of thermodynamics, things fall apart. Structures disintegrate. Buckminster Fuller hinted at the reason we are here. By creating things, by thinking up new combinations, we counteract this flow of entropy, and we make new structures, new wholenesses, so the universe comes out even." But in current economic practice, it has not come out even. Matter must come from energy and wealth from debt. And quoting my friend and political economist Eric Zenzi, wealth is necessarily, and I quote, limited by the amount of low entropy energy that it can sustainably suck from its environment, and by the amount of high entropy effluent from an economy that the environment can sustainably absorb. Now, when debt, unquote, when debt exceeds the capacity of the environment, both physical and social, as recent events would suggest, and as Malthus and Soddy predicted, correction happens often, unfortunately, through crisis. But more recent work by the Romanian-born economist Georgescu Rogan models the economy on a living system, perhaps a more apt metaphor for the economy, one that makes explicit the direct relationship between the consequences of a capitalist economy, energy, and entropy, and between ecology and economy, if you recall, both of which have the same root. In the meantime, it behooves us to think that we might be better to make less things and more sustainable combinations so that the universe still comes out even. Professor of aesthetics Elaine Scarry, in her small book titled On Beauty and Being Just, writes in the chapters entitled On Beauty and Being Wrong and On Beauty and Being Fair, that, quote, what is beautiful is in league with what is true, and there is no way to be in a high state of alert toward injustices, to subjects that because they entail injuries must bring distress, without simultaneously demanding of oneself precisely the level of perceptual acuity that will forever be opening one to the arrival of beautiful sights and sounds, unquote. Conversely, search for truth that seeks beauty requires a level of openness that also leaves us susceptible to insult. And Scarry continues, through its beauty, the world continually recommits us to a rigorous standard of perceptual care. If we do not seek it out, it comes and finds us. Thank you. I'd be happy to answer questions. I know I went a little long, but I forgot to tell you that I really get a kick out of these transitions. I don't know if any of you have read Edward Tufte's book on 28-page paper on how PowerPoints make you stupid, but I'm going to do it again. Any questions? Yeah. New urbanism. Uh-huh. Right. New urbanism, for those of you who don't know, is a congress, actually, but it's also an idea about development that has to do with, in part, walkable communities and communities that have designed within them commercial districts that you can walk to, and they're often connected to public transportation so that you don't necessarily have to have a car, and I think all of those ideas are very good. Many of them are also very prescriptive in what the houses look like and tend towards nostalgic sort of, I think, memories of historic neighborhoods. And while I think many of the principles of new urbanism are fantastic, I think legislating what used to be a agreement within a community through a process of self-determination can't be legislated through design guidelines and be of any value. In other words, and I would use this illustration, my friend Michael Willis says that shined shoes used to be an indication of care, someone took care. Now that shoes can be made permanently shiny, they may indicate, but they can't demonstrate care. In a community, when they have design guidelines, and those guidelines are the product of a community process where citizens and neighbors come together and decide together that they want to have something be a certain way, and they agree to that, and that happens, what happens is a demonstration of that process and that care and that collective agreement. When it's legislated, or when it's a part of a design guideline that happens outside of that process, it doesn't have that value. And I think we think it does. Suburban development, we know, is unsustainable. Some of the most difficult challenges that the city of St. Louis is facing right now are in the suburbs. Home foreclosures and all of the rest. Of course, the energy costs and things are acutely sort of bringing to the surface the fact that the public transportation infrastructure is not a support system to those suburbs. That's happening all over the country. So we know that. The big question is, how do we change that kind of development? But more importantly, how do we adapt that development to be sustainable? Because we can't just take it down. We can't imagine that it doesn't exist. So it's a real design challenge, and people are working on it all over the country. We're now beginning to understand that communities that develop in relationship to public transportation infrastructure have a very high degree of success over the long term and are more sustainable. Add that to the opportunity for people to walk within their community, and that doubles. But one of the things that's happening worldwide right now is that, of course, we've heard the statistics, more people now live in cities than live in rural communities. And while that initially may seem a little daunting, what is a part of that reality is that there are few single factors in the world that have contributed to the decline in world poverty than urbanization. When people move from rural communities to the city, even though they're often in difficult circumstances, they almost always raise their level of education, they raise their access to health care, and in particular, with respect to women, they have the opportunity to become educated in a way that they didn't often have in rural communities. Now I'm talking about places in developing countries. And so the sheer fact of urbanization is turning out to be an incredibly positive phenomenon in that regard. So it's a complicated problem, but one we're all working on, I think. What opportunities do I see for Haiti? Some of you may have noted that they've begun to compare the challenges or the differences between the earthquake in Chile and the earthquake in Haiti. You may have heard that the earthquake in Chile was 10 times more severe in terms of the magnitude than the one in Haiti. And they're saying, in part, because Chile had very well-administered building codes. And so the death toll was not at all what it would have been. I had a friend who's, I met an architect, or an engineer, who works on construction methods and technologies around the world relative to traditional building techniques in relationship to earthquake preparedness. And he was teaching, moving into small communities, like communities in Haiti, and trying to teach the citizens how to build better. And he found that there were social and cultural traditions of how people built that were very difficult to sort of propose changes to. And so he began to realize that his challenge was as much a sociological problem as a technical problem. And so some of those challenges certainly exist forward in Haiti. But I can say proudly that one of our graduates a week ago headed to Haiti to head up the Architecture for Humanities efforts there, where they'll be working to educate, or among other things, educate some of the building trades on better building technologies to hopefully prepare the city's redevelopment in a better way. But it's a very difficult problem. And in some ways it highlights the fact that it really wasn't a natural disaster, but in some ways a human disaster. Yeah. LEAD? The question was, how does our program compare with the LEAD program? Some of you may know about LEAD. LEAD is an acronym for, or abbreviation for Leadership in Energy and Environmental Design. And it's a national United States standard for certifying the specific issues related to sustainability in buildings. Your building can be certified platinum, gold, bronze, or certified, and platinum is the highest level. And it means that the building has to meet certain standards relative to a whole range of issues related to sustainability. And if it does, it receives a platinum rating. And is a kind of standard of excellence for the building's design and also its construction, and also its the way it's managed and the way it operates through its lifespan. To give you an example of one of the ways in which that's measured, it's a point system, and to get a particular point in a LEED evaluation, the building has to be built with materials that come from no further away than a 500-mile radius of the building site, which means that the shipping of the materials to the building site is not using excess energy in transportation costs, which is a phenomenal thing. It encourages the building to be built with materials that are local, in a sense. And so LEED has been enormously influential. It's a rating program, and we have faculty that teach courses in it. Catalina Frexis is an amazing woman who knows it inside and out. She was telling me the other day that I think over 50 people have taken her class, and you can take an exam to become a LEED accredited professional, and 24 of the students have passed the exam. In fact, none that have taken it have failed. And so it's a very important thing. It is increasingly becoming a standard of what would be called good practice. There are other rating systems like it around the world, and I think in the next few years it will really be a kind of base mark for a building's design and construction.
We have time for one more question.
Yeah. Walmart, that's an interesting question. We've had students, the University of Arkansas is in an interesting place. Their School of Architecture is in Bentonville. And for a long time, the students have been working with Walmart, and they've been quite generous in supporting financially studios and design exercises with architecture students to not only look at how they can design and build their buildings more sustainably, but what they can do with the old ones. I don't know if you've ever seen an empty Walmart building, but they're around. And so they've been working on things like that. Because of their network and their influence, of course, when they do something, it can have a big impact. I think what's really positive is that they're starting to understand to some degree their responsibility in relationship to these kinds of things. And so there are now test stores that are LEED certified, and they're designing and building more of them, and they're even doing some other things related to their distribution networks that are hopefully beginning to indicate even a bigger change in how they operate. The richest woman in the world, by the way, you may have saw her picture. It's interesting, and it has to do with the economy of scale. When I was a young professor at Carnegie Mellon 25 years ago, one of my faculty and a real knowledgeable guy about sustainability said that all the good that you do in your career will be offset by the increasing use of air conditioning in China. So, oh, good. Thanks for that. You know. So, and I thought about it, and I said, you know, that could be right. You know, and we can't say to China you can't have air conditioning. So, but then I saw this article about the world's richest woman. 5 years ago, she was visiting the United States on vacation with her husband, and she was fascinated with recycling programs in the United States, and in particular with paper, because her husband had been involved in paper manufacturing. So she went back to China and started a business that imported all the recycled cardboard from the United States and started a box making factory in China using recycled paper from the United States, and it quickly grew and of course became very profitable, and then they used the boxes to ship stuff from China back to the United States. So in a matter of a few years, she became the world's richest woman. And what it told to me was that, you know, of course, China understands these issues, you know, and the importance of them. And when that scale happens, you know, in the other direction, amazing things can happen very quickly. You know, when 3 billion people sort of start recycling, imagine what happens. So, thank you very much.